Right. Hello, I'm Dr. Mitch Brown from University of Arkansas, and today I will be discussing facial formidability as it informs the experiences within professional wrestling. These data have recently been published in the journal Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences. All right, so in this case here, I consider pro wrestling oftentimes, as as we all do, as a form of dramaturgy, as simulated combat. And there's quite a bit of evolutionary history that actually points to the notion of how this kind of unfolds. And for the most part here, pro wrestling appears to rely on what are known as implicit theories of combat, and also understanding the abilities of those who are involved in this combat. In other words, pro wrestling relies on the fact that we understand how combat's supposed to work, what's considered a fair fight, and we also have an understanding of who's ultimately going to participate in such performances. More specifically, as to what an implicit theory is from the world of social psychology, is the expectation of another person's behaviors or their traits, oftentimes based on visible mannerisms and the appearance of a social target. And from there, as we develop these theories of another person's behaviors or abilities, we oftentimes have expectations for how a combat could unfold, and this will ultimately lead to specific expectations for who could potentially win in a fight. And in this case here, this understanding of who would win in a fight, which is basically literally every day I've had since middle school in those conversations, the question they can turn to, what makes for a successful professional wrestler, and can we infer this based on their physical appearance? Nope. And the thing is, not only we as fans could potentially be aware of this, but there's also the possibility that promoters could be aware of these implicit theories, what constitutes, a formidable combatant or possibly a successful wrestler, i.e., someone who could help make a lot of money and they can make as a top star. In this case here, they would likely book the performers who appear the most formidable as the top guys. And the thing is, well, two things on this from a historical perspective. Men's formidability is oftentimes very easily identified, whether it's through cues of upper body strength, facial structures, which I'll get to in a second. And this is often done in a very quick, very automatic process. And people are again, very quick to recognize that such men oftentimes are highly successful in physical conflict themselves. And from this evolved psychology, we see an interesting dovetailing of this knowledge with the fact that historically, wrestling promoters would oftentimes use legit tough guys or shoot fighters as their champions, going from Lou Thesz, Danny Hodge, or even modern day Kurt Angle. Oftentimes, these were the individuals who would potentially be able to win real fights. Historically, it was always so if someone were to renege from the script actually and try to win the title legitimately, the champion would be able to save face and actually beat the reneging opponent and be considered a legitimate champion. Lou Thesz did it multiple times. It did not work out for anyone who tried to do that to him. He had to stop people from doing that. In this case here, as we're trying to infer men's physical prowess to where they could ultimately be considered, a viable professional wrestling star, one can start to think to themselves, what are the actual physical underpinnings of being considered a successful pro wrestler? Well, again, being informed by evolutionary theory, humans appear to have developed this perceptual system that helps them identify individuals based on their physical appearance and the degree to which these individuals could potentially satisfy or even threaten somebody's salient social goals. So in this case here, when it comes to formidability, we can recognize a formidable man as possibly imposing physical threats to another person or potentially affording protection for another person relatively immediately. And given the fact that humans evolved to stand upright, having face-to-face contact, eye contact is kind of a hallmark in humans, we tend to focus on facial structures. One of these facial structures tends to be facial masculinity. And it turns out, actually, facial masculinity itself it oftentimes connotes upper body strength pretty broadly. So just to give you a little bit more information as what I mean with facial masculinization, this refers primarily to individuals who were exposed to higher levels of androgen in utero, and in turn, ultimately ended up with greater testosteronization within their bodies, and end up with broader faces, squintier eyes, kind of a squarer jawline, typically what we would consider a prototypically male face. And in turn, men with faces are are also perceived as stronger, and there appears to be a kernel of truth to these perceptions. One of the more discrete areas in these spaces from which we can glean this information is what's been previously identified as a facial width to height ratio. So just to give you a bit of an example of this right here, let me move my mouse a little bit. I have two versions of a face here. One face has considered a relatively high facial width to height ratio, squared off in red, and one with a relatively low, squared off in blue. And in this case here, people typically regard individuals with a higher ratio, such as this person right here, as physically stronger, more aggressive, as better fighters, relative to these individuals right here. Typically speaking, men with these wider faces, they tend to have higher levels of prenatal testosterone, more androgen surges when they were in adolescence, and the height of the face ultimately makes them appear angrier. I can get into some nuance on that, but I don't think you guys want a discussion on hormones this early on a Saturday morning. But in this case here, men with this higher ratio, they actually tend to be better physical fighters. MMA fighters with a higher ratio, they tend to be better grapplers. They tend to have better win-loss records. And some research even suggests that this higher ratio itself can be, or components of it, a sexually selected trait that would have ultimately helped men throughout intersexual competition or coalitional conflict throughout evolutionary history. And again, there appears to be a strong kernel of truth to this process. That being said, though, despite the levels of truth that we can see through men's facial height ratio, there are still some stereotypes that exist that are kind of unfortunate that may ultimately form our perceptions of men as professional wrestlers vis-a-vis their ratio. We tend to perceive these men as more aggressive. We tend to perceive them as more prone to anger. And more unfortunately, and this one has zero kernel of truth to it, we tend to view men with this higher ratio, these more formidable faces, as less mentally sophisticated, less intelligent, and we ultimately dehumanize them more. We actually perceive them as less tolerant to pain, which, given the previous talk, has some frankly disturbing implications for the way it fully crash off the cell twice. So this leads us to the current research process. I was especially interested in trying to understand this evolutionary theory of formidability and try to apply it to this understanding of the dramaturgy of pro wrestling. And this is especially important, really, considering the fact that over the past few decades, there's been a diversification of different kinds of professional wrestling styles, ones that don't even favor formidability. If you're going to book a certain kind of star as your top guy, sure, formidability could be important, but then what about individuals like Rey Mysterio, Dragon Kid, Kota Ibushi, who don't necessarily rely on these stereotypically masculinized features for their performances? In a sense here, I'm arguing that the various wrestling styles represent specific evolutionary niches, and our understanding of formidability may actually conflict with our understanding of a character as a top star, as informed by their facial features. So again, we have so in addition to your more traditional styles of wrestlers, we've introduced the notion of high flyers, technicians, those whose physical prowess is not necessarily based on their upper body strength. And then, of course, because of pro wrestling, there's also need to understand showmanship and the potential underpinnings of dramaturgy. So in this case, how does facial width to height ratio inform perceptions of men's abilities as wrestlers to fans? So this led me to a series of hypotheses for an experiment that I conducted. So because we stereotype high ratio men as stronger and more rugged, we should view them as more effective brawlers and powerhouses. But the stereotype of low ratio men as more intelligent should lead us to perceive them as more effective high flyers and technicians. And also, too, these stereotypes of high ratio men as aggressive and good fighters, we should probably will be more likely to stereotype them as being more effective as a heel and ultimately give them more of a push as a performer. So for the current study, I recruited a sample of 100 wrestling fans through Reddit and various social media outlets, and I had them evaluate 10 hypothetical professional wrestlers for their abilities as if they were hypothetical bookers. Specifically, I tasked participants to evaluate these 10 hypothetical wrestlers as brawlers, flyers, powerhouses, technicians, and showmen, different wrestling styles as characterized by IWDB. And I gave my participants brief descriptions as to what this could look like and examples of performers. I also tasked participants to indicate how effective would this person be at cutting a promo, i.e. a monologue? How well would they be at working the crowd? Would you perceive this person as either a babyface or a heel? And would you push this person as a top guy? And among these questions, I presented single item scales, all operating on 7-point scales, assessing the extent to which one would perceive a hypothetical wrestler this way. So just to show you examples of what these faces look like, here are two examples. So we have a more formidable and a less formidable man. These faces were derived from the Chicago Faces database and have been previously pre-tested to systematically differ in aggression and hostility. More specifically, I chose 5 faces that were from the top 10 and the bottom 10 for facial to height ratio as measured by previous researchers. And I specifically chose individuals who were relatively about the same age, i.e. the same age that most young men would likely join WWE and end up in NXT for a little bit. And again, I have 5 high and 5 high and 5 low ratio men that participants evaluated. So this part here, there's a little bit of stats here. So I hope I'm not traumatizing you on a Saturday morning. Orient you to the graph a little bit. Scale of 1 to 7, how effective is this person as a performer for a specific style? And then we have our 5 different styles right there. Black bar represents high ratio, white bar represents low ratio. So in this case here, what I ended up with, high ratio men were perceived as more effective brawlers and powerhouses, whereas low ratio men were perceived as better flyers and technicians. Although the effect, as you can see here for technicians, was substantially smaller than it is for high flyers. And I can get into that nuance a bit later, actually, if you're interested. But there's no difference in terms of perceptions of high and low ratio men as showmen, if you will. Even further, high ratio men were further perceived as better workers, better at promos, and participants wanted to push them more. The high ratio men were also perceived more likely to be the heel. Low ratio men were perceived more likely to be a babyface. So a little bit of a discussion here. These perceptions of high ratio men, it may be informative as insofar as saying we have this implicit theory of combat and a successful combatant, and this may line up with our ancestral knowledge of what constitutes formidability and a good combatant. And again, this likely tracks sexually selected traits in men, given the fact that historically men were more likely to engage in physical conflict relative to women. That said, though, low ratio men were perceived as being more effective at styles that may require mental finesse. And sometimes this is unfortunately based on the fact that we stereotype low ratio men as more intelligent, more mentally complex. And in many ways, too, we consider high ratio men as, well, we view them as more likely to be cannon fodder in some ways. I can discuss that a little bit more with some other data that I have based on perceiving high ratio men as less prone to psychiatric disorders. But the effect size was much smaller for technicians, which may point to the fact that technical acumen may also map onto upper body strength, which is unsurprising given the fact that high ratio men are seen as better grapplers overall. Now, at this point here, what kinds of future directions would I like to take in this research? One thing I'd like to try moving forward. So as you previously saw, the stimuli that I used were primarily young white men. So I'd like to try to see if I can intersect this with various racial cues. Previous research shows that formidability inferences manifest differently relative to whether the male target is black, white, or other ethnic groups entirely, to where I'd like to conduct future studies to make those specific kinds of comparisons. Even further, one thing I'd like to do is move beyond just the simple stereotypes. Are there kernels of truth to these inferences? Are men with higher facial width to height ratios actually objectively regarded as better performance in some styles versus others? Are they more likely to get pushed? Are they more likely to be a heel? So this is an outlet that I like to consider as I dive headfirst into some archival data eventually. All right, that's it for me here. Just want to give us some acknowledgments to the internet wrestling community for being so generous with the data they provided, particularly those connected with Wrestling Observer newsletter. They were really supportive of this, actually. I want to thank this organization for their help, and both the editor and a reviewer for this paper that it's where it ended up being just this fruitful collaboration. I have a QR code on screen for the paper online if anyone's interested. Thank you so much for helping me get out of my comfort zone, and I really hope that my scientific jargon was not too terrifying. Thank you so much.
Not terrifying at all. Dig it. I love it.
Thank you.
Looks like you do have a question in the chat from John. How does the Shador mask, which both hides and accentuates facial features, how does that fit in within your perception?
Oh, and I'm really, really glad you showed that, actually. That, coincidentally, a very nice reviewer had that question, too. So in this case here, that leads to an interesting point, because so a lot of these inferences of facial width to height ratio, so in many ways, they are considered universal. But at the same time, though, other aspects of these ratios tend to be less informative in other cultures. I think in Mexico, the mask would likely occlude things. Now, at the same time, though, facial structures tend to co-vary with body size. So the higher ratios do exist on physically larger men overall. But I do think that there's a degree of inclusion with the mask that likely would make this signal value be more truncated in Mexico, actually. I think that Mexico provides an interesting ecological niche that would kind of preclude this from being that strong of a signal. So a nice little mix between cultural and evolutionary factors.
Huge. Yeah, John, did you have another comment? I saw you nodding a little bit.
No, that's interesting. You mentioned Rey Mysterio, and now you're taking the answer completely down in south of the border. I think that the other part of that would be, are we reading the masks differently in America than they would be in Mexico? And the kind of thinking the structure of the mask as a pseudo face, so they actually highlight those differences and then widen them proportionally. But no, it's a great answer. Thank you.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, in retrospect now, as I look at it, I just think like Dos Caras' mask was, I mean, his face looks a bit wider relative to other ones. So that's a real interesting thought. Thank you.
And what about, or maybe I might have missed this part, I don't think so, but like heavy makeup, right? So like when Finn Balor, right, is the demon and it's like a mask, but it's just all the paint, right? Like on his face, or like, gosh, why am I blanking on her name? Asuka, you know what I mean? Or some of the Japanese female wrestlers, you know, that just wear heavy makeup. Does that kind of fit in too?
For makeup, actually, that's an interesting thing. I've not gone there yet. There is some research looking at the actual signal value of makeup and faces. For men's faces, I think what will happen is that there'll be a distraction of that signal value. It becomes a bit less perceptually salient, if I want to borrow some social psych terms. But for women though, actually, I don't think that facial width to height ratio makes that much of a difference. Just because previous research shows that these ratios tend not to be predictive of women's physical prowess as much, likely just because different evolutionary histories. But yeah, I do think that makeup likely does absolutely have an influence on the way it informs men's faces.